Hi, my name is Ellen Fridland. I'm a postdoc in philosophy of mind at Berlin School of Mind and Brain, and today I'm going to be commenting on Glenn Carruthers and Liz Schier's paper, Dissolving the Hard Problem of Consciousness. First off, let me thank Richard Brown for organizing this online conference. It's a real pleasure to read and comment on the work of Glenn and Liz, two very good philosophers who used to work down the road from me here in Berlin, but now who work down under. This is a nice way to stay connected, so thank you, Richard, for helping to make the world a little bit smaller. Now, in Dissolving the Hard Problem of Consciousness, Glenn and Liz argue first against David Chalmers and then against Frank Jackson and Thomas Nagel that there is no hard problem of consciousness because the intuitions required for conceiving of zombies or Mary or bats, that is, the very intuitions that serve as the foundation for arguments for the hard problem, are not theory neutral, but rather presuppose the existence of the problem. As such, the existence of the hard problem of consciousness cannot be derived from the conceivability of zombies in the Chalmers case, because conceiving of zombies assumes the hard problem of consciousness. In short, zombie thought experiments, they claim, beg the question. In my comments, I'm going to focus on the argument that Glenn and Liz give against the conceivability of zombies, since I think this is where their most substantial work is done, and also because the claims that come in later sections about Jackson's Mary and Nagel's bat, as I understand them, largely generalize the objection to the hard problem to learning something new and to knowing what it's like. Now, before I say what I think is wrong with Glenn and Liz's argument, I want to say that I really enjoyed reading this paper and that, in spirit, I agree with Glenn and Liz that the Chalmers approach to philosophical argument is a little bit fishy. In particular, in reading this paper, I became more and more suspicious of the methodology of using thought experiments and intuitions as the basis of philosophical argument. As Glenn and Liz say, quote, "Instead of letting our conclusions on the thought experiments guide our theories of consciousness, we should let our theories of consciousness guide our conclusions from the thought experiments." And I think this is absolutely right. I see no reason to give our pre-theoretical intuitions any kind of privilege in dictating what is or is not the case in reality, or what could or couldn't be the case in some alternate reality. It just seems to me that our common sense intuitions are often, or maybe even always, in direct conflict with what the best science we have tells us about the way the world is. And this conflict doesn't at all threaten scientific explanation in general, and so I don't see why it should threaten scientific explanations about consciousness. We often just take such conflict to show that the way the world is often surprisingly different than the way we think it is. And if this can go for solid objects, the shape of the earth and the nature of light, I see no reason why it shouldn't go for consciousness as well. I think that Glenn and Liz share this general point of view, and as I said, it was nice to see someone asserting just how little intuitions matter in philosophy of mind. That said, I do have some problems with the particular way in which Glenn and Liz argue for the theory-latedness of the intuitions underwriting conceivability that then ground their claims about the question-begging nature of zombie thought experiments and the hard problem of consciousness. Let me quickly go over their argument in order to point out where it seems to go wrong. In order to show that intuitions that guide the possibility of conceiving of zombies are not theory neutral, Glenn and Liz begin by putting some constraints on the concept of conceivability. They claim that for conceivability to be informative, conceivability must be defined or limited in various ways. That is, conceivability must be more than simply not leading to, in their words, immediately identifiable contradiction, because such conceivability, they claim, is trivial. Glenn and Liz say that I can, in this sense, conceive that when I drop a cup, it will hover in place, or that my sister's dog will call me for a chat. Conceivability, in this sense, tells us precisely nothing about the world or about consciousness. Now, let us grant that the hovering cup and chatty dog tell us nothing about consciousness. Is it true that if we are concerned with metaphysical possibility, they also tell us nothing about the relation between mass, weight, and gravity, or the relation between intelligence and language? I'm not sure, but let's proceed. Glenn and Liz also say that conceivability must be more than the capacity to form a mental representation of some state of affairs, because we can form mental representations of scenarios that are impossible. They say that I can repeat, "That's a square circle," to myself, but that doesn't mean I've conceived of a square circle in the relevant informative way. I'd claim that one hasn't even mentally represented a square circle to oneself in this case. But that doesn't really matter either. Let's grant with some reservation that conceivability requires more than not leading to directly identifiable contradiction, and also that it requires more than a simple mental representation. What more could there be? Glenn and Liz claim that for conceivability to be genuinely informative, conceivability requires mental representation, quote, that coheres with our knowledge of, at least, other a priori truths. They go on to say that, quote, to conceive of a zombie is to mentally represent it in a way that is coherent with what else we know to be true. Notice the slip here from coherence with at least a priori truths to coherence with what else we know to be true. This is precisely, I think, where Glenn and Liz lose the force of their argument. Glenn and Liz continue to argue that conceivability requires coherence with what we know to be true, and that means that it requires coherence with, at least for the non-dualist, the belief that structure and function of mental states must be sufficient to explain their phenomenal character. Glenn and Liz claim that one cannot have this belief and conceive of zombies. Thus, one must be a dualist, that is, already think that there is a hard problem of consciousness if one is able to conceive in any informative way of zombies. That's how they get the claim that conceiving of zombies begs the question about the hard problem of consciousness. But we have to be careful about the fact that there are two notions of conceivability at play here. One, as coherence with a priori truths, and two, as coherence with what we know to be true, a posteriori or contingently. And importantly, we should notice that coherence with a posteriori knowledge is what does the heavy lifting for Liz and Glenn. After all, the belief that, quote, the structure and function of mental states is sufficient to explain phenomenal character, end quote, even on their account, is not an a priori truth. How could it be a priori? As they put it, it follows from various considerations about the intolerability of dualism. So the belief in the structure and function of a mental state accounting for phenomenal qualities might count as knowledge, but it isn't in any ordinary sense a priori knowledge. So it is not coherence with a priori truths that does the work on Glenn and Liz's account. It is rather coherence with knowledge of what we know to be true in the actual world that they use to bolster their accusation about the question-begging character of zombie thought experiments. But is it possible that conceivability requires coherence with all our knowledge about the way the world actually is? Certainly not on Chalmers' account. Chalmers, in no uncertain terms, claims that this kind of conceivability is not what he's after. In Does Conceivability Entail Possibility, he states, quote, for example, it seems conceivable that an object could travel faster than 1 billion meters per second. This hypothesis is physically and naturally impossible because it contradicts the laws of physics and the laws of nature. This case may be metaphysically possible, however, since there might be metaphysically possible worlds with different laws. Even if we invoke an intuitive conception of a metaphysically possible world as a world that God might have created if he had chosen to, it seems that God could have created a world in which an object traveled faster than 1 billion meters per second. So in this case, although conceivability does not mirror natural possibility, it may well mirror metaphysical possibility. Now, this shows that conceivability of the Chalmers variety does not require coherence with all of the natural or actual laws, but only with the metaphysically possible ones. So it couldn't be that coherence with the belief that the structure and function of a mental state accounts for its phenomenal field counts as a belief that we must take into account for limiting our conceivability claims. Moreover, it seems that if we did have to take into account all of our knowledge about the way the world is, then we would leave very little room for conceivability. After all, I know my mother is an honest woman. Does this mean that I cannot conceive of her as a thief? On Glenn and Liz's notion of conceivability, it seems that I cannot. Likewise, I know my husband to be a U.S. citizen. Does this mean that I cannot conceive of him as an Australian? Obviously, if conceivability must take into consideration all of the knowledge that I have, then this too ends up being inconceivable. But this only shows that the notion that Glenn and Liz have forwarded for regarding conceivability is too strong. However, if we weaken the requirement for conceivability in order to reflect the initial formulation that Glenn and Liz give, that is, coherence with at least a priori truths, then it doesn't seem that I must be a dualist in order to conceive of zombies. After all, I am not a dualist. I believe that structure and function dictate phenomenal field, but I don't take this to be an a priori truth, and so I can conceive of zombies in the way that isn't in conflict with any of these kinds of truths. So it turns out that I'm not begging the question, because neither dualism nor materialism, physicalism, functionalism, supervenience, etc. are a priori, even if they turn out to be necessary and a posteriori. They wouldn't, I don't think, count as a limitation of conceivability as Chalmers conceives of it. To end, I think that Glenn and Liz have to provide a more robust argument against Chalmers as to what the notion of conceivability requires, if they are going to show that the intuitions for zombies beg the question against the hard problem of consciousness. And I don't think they've made this case. However, I do think that they've shown that if we are concerned with the natural or actual world, then we don't need to be concerned with zombies, because in this world, structure and function dictate phenomenal field, and even if the metaphysical possibility exists that structure and function don't dictate phenomenal field in all worlds, this is largely irrelevant to those of us who are looking for explanations about how things are, and not for explanations about how things would be if everything wasn't the way that it actually is. Thank you.